In the heart of rural West Virginia, where life moved slow and everyone knew everyone's business, there stood a small roadside diner called Annie's Table. The building itself was nothing to look at: faded white paint, a flickering neon sign, and windows fogged over by years of grease and coffee steam. But for the locals, it was more than just a place to eat. It was a gathering spot, a quiet refuge from the daily grind, and for some, a second home. Behind the counter, always with her apron tied tight and a fresh pot of coffee brewing, was Annie Carter, a woman known just as much for her kindness as for her famous cornbread and fried eggs. Annie was 53 years old and had been running the diner by herself ever since her husband, Darrell, passed away in a mining accident nearly a decade earlier. Their son, Josh, had moved out of town for college and eventually settled in a city hundreds of miles away. Life hadn't been easy for Annie, but she carried herself with grace. Each morning, she opened the doors before sunrise, served every customer with a smile, and quietly paid off debt from hospital bills, repairs, and the general grind of keeping a business alive in a town that was slowly dying. It was on a rainy Tuesday morning that everything changed. The clouds had rolled in early, and thunder cracked across the hills as Annie prepped the morning specials. Only a handful of regulars had come in: old farmers, factory workers, and one retired teacher who always sat by the window. The mood was quiet until the distant rumble of a motorcycle broke the silence. Moments later, a tall, broad-shouldered man stepped through the door, bringing with him a gust of wind and a trail of rain. He was hard to miss. Wearing a worn-out leather vest patched with a faded emblem, tattoos wrapped down both arms like ivy, and long black hair tied behind his neck. His heavy boots thudded against the wooden floor. Conversations stopped. Forks froze halfway to mouths. Annie looked up and met his eyes. They were tired, guarded, but not unkind. He walked up to the counter and said only, "Coffee." "Black." She poured him a cup without asking questions. He nodded in thanks and sat at the far end of the counter. Murmurs began almost immediately. Someone muttered, "Damn biker trash," under their breath. Another man laughed nervously and nudged his buddy, whispering something about gang trouble. Annie heard it all, but the biker seemed unfazed. He sipped his coffee quietly, watching the rain slide down the windows. 20 minutes later, the front door swung open again. This time, it was Officers Jenkins and Rowe, two local cops with a reputation for arrogance and power trips. Jenkins scanned the room, locked eyes on the biker, and walked straight toward him. "Let's see some ID," he barked. The biker turned his head slowly. "Am I being detained?" Rowe stepped up beside Jenkins. "Don't play smart. You match a description. Now show us your license." The diner fell silent. Annie felt her heart rate rise. Something about the way the biker was being treated felt wrong. She'd seen plenty of rough characters over the years, but this man hadn't done a single thing. He hadn't caused trouble, hadn't raised his voice, hadn't even looked at anyone the wrong way. He just drank his coffee and minded his business. Before the situation could escalate, Annie wiped her hands on her apron and walked over. "He's been here the whole time," she said firmly. "He hasn't bothered anyone." Jenkins didn't even look at her. "Ma'am, this doesn't concern you." She took a deep breath. "Actually, it does. This is my diner. He's a customer. And unless you have a warrant or a charge, you don't get to harass people here." Rose's expression darkened. "Are you really going to interfere with an investigation?" Annie held her ground. "You're not investigating anything. You're intimidating someone based on how he looks. That's not justice. That's prejudice." A tense silence fell over the room. The biker slowly pulled out his wallet and handed over his ID. Rose stepped outside to run it while Jenkins stood there, arms crossed, trying to stare him down. Annie didn't budge. A few minutes later, Rowe returned. Nothing came up. No warrants. No priors. Jenkins grunted and tossed the ID back on the counter. "We'll be watching," he said, and both men turned and left. As the door closed behind them, the biker looked at Annie for the first time with real gratitude. "Most folks don't do that," he said. She offered a small smile. "Most folks forget how to treat people with respect." He extended his hand. "Name's Hawk." "Annie," she replied, shaking it. Hawk finished his coffee and left quietly, tipping more than his meal cost. Annie figured she'd never see him again. She was wrong. The next morning began like any other. Annie opened the diner just before 6 a.m., flipped the sign to open, and started brewing coffee. By 6:30, she heard the rumble again. But this time, it didn't stop. It grew louder. Stronger. The ground itself seemed to vibrate. She walked to the window and froze. Bikes. Not one. Not 10. Hundreds. Hay came in waves, filling the street, parking lot, and even the shoulder of the highway. Riders in leather vests, patched jackets, bandanas, and helmets. The sun glinted off chrome as more and more arrived. Locals stepped out of their houses, stunned by the sight. Annie stepped outside just as Hawk pulled up at the front, flanked by a dozen other bikers with grim, weathered faces. He took off his helmet and smiled. "We heard what you did," he said. "So we came to say thank you." Behind him, bikers began dismounting and filing into the diner. They filled every booth, every seat at the counter. Some sat on the floor. Others stood outside, chatting, laughing, swapping stories. A few of them started helping clearing tables, washing dishes, even cooking alongside Annie in the kitchen. One of them pulled out a helmet and started passing it around. No one asked what it was for. They just dropped in bills. Fives. Tens. Hundreds. By the time it came back to Hawk, it was overflowing. He set it on the counter and slid it toward Annie. "Use it for the diner. Or don't. Use it for whatever you need." Her hands trembled. I can't accept this." Hawk shook his head. "You didn't ask. But we don't forget loyalty. You stood up for one of us. Now all of us stand for you." Tears welled up in Annie's eyes as she looked around. The diner was buzzing, not with fear, but with energy, love, and respect. These men, feared and judged by so many, had come not with violence, but with gratitude. The video of the bikers taking over the diner spread online like wildfire. Someone had recorded Hawk's speech. Within 24 hours, it had been viewed over 1 million times. Reporters started showing up. Donations poured in from strangers around the country. Annie's phone rang nonstop. People sent letters, thank you cards, and offers to help her business. But what touched Annie most was what the town began to realize. The same people who once sneered at the sight of a biker now started to open their hearts. They saw the humanity behind the vests. The brotherhood. The loyalty. And they saw Annie, small, quiet Annie, transform into a symbol of bravery. With the money raised that day and the flood of support that followed, Annie paid off the last of her debts. She fixed the leaky roof. Replaced the old fryers. Even hired 2 staff members to help her keep up with the new demand. A week later, a custom-made wooden plaque arrived in the mail. Burned into the grain were the words, "To Annie. For courage in the face of power. For compassion in the face of judgment. For standing tall when it mattered most. You are now and forever family." Beneath it were the insignias of over 20 biker clubs. She hung it above the register. Over time, Annie and Hawk grew close. He stopped in often, sometimes alone, sometimes with friends. They never talked much about that day, but they didn't need to. They understood something that didn't require words: mutual respect. Years later, when Annie retired, she passed the diner on to a young couple who had once been regular customers. The name Annie's Table remained, as did the plaque and the photo of that unforgettable morning with hundreds of bikers gathered in front. And every year on the anniversary of that day, they came back. Not all of them. But enough. Engines would roar down the road once again. Coffee would flow. Laughter would echo. And somewhere in the crowd, someone would tell the story of the woman who risked everything for a stranger and gained a family made of steel, leather, and unbreakable loyalty.